Well, good morning and welcome to Elevenses. The show today is on the Monday the 3rd. It should have been yesterday, Sunday the 2nd, but due to a cock up on my part, I was away from home and I completely forgotten to take my laptop with me. I have had to delay it for a day. But anyway, it's a roundup of 2021 second half, from July to December. The absurd stories, the serious stories, the weird stories, anything that caught my attention over the previous year. Before I go on with that, though, I will just remind you once again the latest of my webcast events is going to be on Wednesday, and I will just pop in the link for you to find there. It's all about filtering, and the question I'm going to be asking is filtering a science or is it an art? And do you need brains or do you need balls to filter well? So I'll be covering what's legal, what's illegal, and what's just plain common good sense. And I'll say that from my perspective as a former motorcycle courier. It's always a hot topic, so if you're interested in filtering, if it's something that interests you, do look in on that particular show. Now, don't forget, you are tuned to Elevenses. I am Kevin Williams. This is Survival Skills Rider Training, and this is my event, which normally goes out on Sunday, which is going out a day late. Right, okay, so on with the review of 2021. The not so shock news that hit the headlines in July was the announcement from the government that petrol engined bikes were due to be phased out by 2035. The government's transport decarbonisation plan was announced. It's a 220-page document, and it sets that clear end date for petrol engine motorcycles. And if feasible, it says a faster transition could be made. Now, petrol engined and diesel cars will end in 2030, so it's 5 years earlier than originally planned for the cars, 10 years earlier than the very first deadline, incidentally. And it wasn't pretty obvious that motorcycles would be in the crosshairs, despite the Department for Transport saying in February last year that motorcycles were outside the scope of the initial consultation. Now, it's important to focus on the fact that the ban actually talks about the zero tailpipe emissions. So in theory, as well as electric motorcycles, we could see the development of fuel cell bikes, but their development seems to be even further behind that of electric motorcycles. Now, it didn't take a crystal ball to foresee that many motorcyclists were dead against the idea that the petrol engine would be phased out. And so equally, it was no surprise to learn that within days, MAG were gearing up to fight to keep the internal combustion engine as an option for PTWs for a while to come. And it's also not surprising that the alternative idea that's been popularly floated is that synthetic biofuel could replace petrol from oil dug out of the ground. Now, later in the year, I will go on to look at just how Porsche are actually building a wind farm powered plant in Chile to create just such a fuel. Now, it's zero carbon because the petrol is basically made by fixing the carbon from the atmosphere in the same way as a plant would have done billions of years ago. But as I pointed out back in July, I can't see how that fits with the concept of zero tailpipe emissions. It is possible to manufacture a carbon neutral fuel, but the problem is the chemistry of the problem. If you burn any organic fuel, you are going to create NOx pollutants. Catalyzers can reduce those emissions, but they are not 100% efficient as it stands. Now, later in the year, a research lab would actually test a biofuel that they'd made for themselves, and they'd run it in a standard car. And they found that, if anything, the tailpipe emissions from the vehicle were actually slightly worse than with petroleum-based petrol. So for the time being, at least, I think it's electric motorcycles that we're going to be looking towards for the future, whether you like it or not. One other story that ran over 2021 was the fallout from the collapse of the Stuart Garner-led Norton Company. Now, in July, the owners of the V4 SS were shocked to receive a letter from the new administration telling them that the bike was actually unfixable. The backstory to this is that in May, the new Norton administration sent a letter to everybody who had purchased one of the earlier bikes sold by the Stuart Garner Company, telling them not to ride it as they had detected 35 defects. Now, 20 of those were what Norton described as critical items. And so they were told put the bike under wraps and that Norton would look to fix the machines, even though Norton, the new company, was under no legal obligation to help. They said they would work towards repairing those bikes as a sort of goodwill issue. But the latest update in July essentially said that the bikes were unfixable because Norton were unable to reliably source all the parts needed from the previous administration's suppliers. So that basically leaves owners to approach the liquidators of the old company for compensation. The new Norton did offer a gesture of goodwill that they would offer a new bike to those existing owners once they got their money back from the old company at a special price, and that it would also come with a 2-year warranty. Thankfully, Norton were re-engineering this new V4SS model to fix the issues, and more details of that were to appear later in the year. And essentially what they had done is they dropped the rev limit and reduced the power output. That's one way to get around unreliability issues, I suppose. Another long-running saga, which basically was going on all year, was the backlog of car and bike tests caused by the lockdowns. Now, the DVSA announced fairly quickly they would be recruiting over 300 new examiners. The issue really is, though, whilst they could make that statement, it wouldn't be a quick fix, as they would take time to actually get the examiners recruited and trained up, ready to the standard to take tests. But at least CBT schools were beginning to pick up on the backlog of CBTs that had expired during the long lockdown period. I mistakenly said in the last show CBT lasts 1 year. It does, of course, last 2 years. But what I was really meaning was that by the time that schools were released to run again in March last year, there had been a year of lockdowns and intermittent operation. The DFT also announced that truck driving tests were to be eased, specifically by removing the reversing elements from the test itself. Now, needless to say, this created a huge number of shock horror responses that claimed it would result in poorly trained lorry drivers being unable to go backwards. What they missed was the other part of the announcement, that the manoeuvres would not be tested at the multi-purpose test centres, but would become part of the training element. So in other words, they would be signed off by DVSA approved instructors rather than the DVSA's own examiner. And that's exactly the situation we have, of course, for CBT. So it's not unheard of. And in fact, it actually is not a watering down of standards, but it's simply a move towards what the EU licensing directive had always offered the DFT and DVSA before they went on to gold plate the entire procedure of passing a test. And that was that some of the elements of the tests could actually be signed off by approved instructors. The same applies, incidentally, to the DVSA bike test. So it's an interesting question as to why that's not been offered to motorcyclists. The argument was, of course, that these elements were put into the actual formal test, partly at least to justify the DVSA's huge investment in off-road training facilities, testing facilities. Now, one piece of good news was that the EU agreed to drop the insurance green card requirement for UK drivers and riders. Now, the return of the insurance green card, something many older riders will recall, was another Brexit bonus, of course, because it took the UK back to the days when motorcycling abroad was an adventure in putting together extra paperwork. Now, before the January the 1st, 2021, any car insurance bought in any EU country automatically worked in any other EU country, as well as Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. The agreement lapsed after Brexit, and since January the 1st, all drivers heading to the EU should have applied to their insurer to actually gain a green card, which would extend their insurance to the Europe. And of course, that made the whole thing more expensive. Green cards are technically free, but of course, the insurers find a way to charge for them. Usually, they add an admin fee. As a sort of one-off charge. Typically, it's around £25, and they have a limited life, usually 90 days, but sometimes as little as 30 days. And of course, the other problem was that there was a delay in getting them out, which is bizarre because most insurance these days is actually delivered digitally. I haven't had a posted out insurance certificate for a while. They've all come via email. So why it was taking an insurance company a month to send them out, I don't know. Anyway, put that together, and it was making multiple trips to Europe not only more expensive, but of course more complex. And talking to people, I got the distinct impression that very few drivers were actually aware that they needed a green card to drive into Europe post-Brexit. Anyway, the good news is that that is no longer the case. You can just take your standard insurance abroad and it'll work in the EU. One other story, an unpleasant one really. There are always people ready to prey on somebody else's misfortune. And in one of the most callous acts I heard about last year, Scott Donaldson tried to wheel away a motorcycle that had been left at the side of the road after a rider had was taken to hospital after a collision. Now, fortunately, he only got 200 meters from the accident scene before a police car pulled up to see what he was doing with the bike. It seemed the officer knew that the bike belonged to the woman who had just crashed. He was arrested and charged with theft after admitting he would otherwise have permanently swiped the machine. Another insurance issue was on motorsport. The EU Commission reversed directions on insurance rules. It was something called the VNUK law. Don't ask me what it applies to, I can't remember, but it would have required all motorized vehicles to have third-party insurance. So this would have meant not just those used like our own bikes and cars on public roads, but anything that was used off-road on private land, but where others would have access. Motorsport fell under those proposed new laws, meaning all competitive vehicles would need to be insured. So that would be everything from an F1 car to the thing you potter around on your local motocross track. That largely passed under the radar, being sport, but what got people really upset was when they discovered that it also applied to vehicles that were used on farms or within the household. So mobility buggies, farm quad bikes would have required third-party insurance, but even more bizarrely, so would ride-on lawnmowers used exclusively on your own lawn. They would all have required insurance. So the VNUK law was one of the very first things that the UK government axed after Brexit, but the implications for motorsport were still a significant concern, since the UK has a very powerful build and design presence for everything from F1 to superbikes. So the news went that the EU had axed this particular requirement was good. The UK's Motorcycle Industry Association, of course, stepped up to claim responsibility, but I suspect their voice carried significantly less weight than the F1 circus did. We tend to think of the UK's roads as risky places for bikers, but at least we don't have one problem a pair of riders in India encountered. They were attacked by a leopard. Firoz and Sabir Mansouri were returning home after they bought a birthday cake when a leopard chased them out of a sugarcane field. The bike was unable to outrun the leopard on the muddy village lane, but Sabir, riding pillion, hurled the cake into the animal's face. And that was enough to send the leopard running back into the sugarcane fields. It's a shame that one didn't go viral. I would love to have seen somebody cream pie a video there. In August, if leopards are bad, a story arose on another lethal threat to riders in the Indian subcontinent. It's the unbreakable and almost invisible Chinese manja kite string. Now, kite flying is a popular pastime across quite a lot of India, apparently. And unfortunately, what happens is if the kite gets away from the flyer, it means the string can end up strung across highways. And numerous riders have been killed or seriously injured after they've ridden into the string. Here in the UK, new revisions to the Highway Code were launched with a huge fanfare, and one thing that was particularly pushed was the hierarchy of harm. And this is designed to ensure that those who can do the greatest harm, by which is meant those using powered vehicles, they have the greatest responsibility to reduce the danger they pose to others, which means basically horse riders, cyclists, and pedestrians in that order, the pedestrians being the most vulnerable. You'll note, of course, that this hierarchy of harm ignores one of the most vulnerable road user groups, and that is powered two-wheeler operators. Also in Norton, the pensions regulator announced that, so in August, I should say, the former pension start again. Also in August, the pension regulator announced that the former Norton Motorcycles director and owner, Stuart Garner, would face court for breaching rules on ploughing cash from staff pension funds into his business. And later in the year, his court appearance was put back to 2022. So that story is still going. Over in France, some stories. A new trial into filtering meant that bikers could filter again in 21 departments. Some departments also raised the speed limit back to 90 kph on rural roads from 80. But you have to know which rules apply where, because it's not universal. Less welcome to French bikers was the news that roadworthiness tests for bikes were to be brought in, and then astonishingly, President Macron stepped in the very next day and personally overturned that ruling. MotoGP, the news that many had expected for a number of years, finally arrived. Valentino Rossi announced his retirement to leave MotoGP at the end of 2021 at the age of 42. Now, his career, as I explained at the time, lasted over a quarter of a century, and it's the longest of any rider ever in the top class. He dominated the first decade of the 21st century. He won both 125 and 250 world titles, and then went on to win 7 more world titles at the top level. And it's basically he spanned the era from 2-strokes to 4-strokes, and not just from 2-stroke to 4-stroke, but also from the changes in the way 4-stroke bikes have been built. If Valentino Rossi announced his retirement voluntarily, Maverick Vinales probably ended any hopes that he will ever have of a title at the top level when he was unceremoniously exited from the Yamaha squad. In mid-August, he was, as Yamaha put it, withdrawn from MotoGP events after what they described as unexplained irregular operation of his race bike. Video then emerged of him riding along the straight at the back end of the race, way down the positioning, bouncing the engine off the rev limiter. He was then suspended, and finally the 5-year partnership was terminated by mutual consent, according to Yamaha, shortly after Vinales confirmed that he would be making an end-of-season move to Aprilia. I think most of us would call that being given the sack. It's not the first time Vinales fell out with the team. He actually walked out on the Blue Suns of India team in Moto3 mid-season in 2012, when a lack of consistency dropped him out of title contention. With coronavirus receding, I'd personally penciled in plans to visit the only genuine road race venue in England, and that was to see the Scarborough Gold Cup in September, but once again that was cancelled due to infrastructure and insurance issues. Prior events had been axed when safety inspections by the council had concluded that many of the buildings were unsound and unfit for public use. The council agreed to carry out the demolition work, but with costs running to 6 figures, there appeared to be a debate about who would pay. With statements floating around like the venue needs a significant investment, I think there must be a question mark over road racing will ever return to the Oliver's Mount circuit, and if it doesn't, it will be a shame. Another long-running on-off saga was around the variously named road races proposed for circuits on the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight road races were finally scheduled for 20th to 23rd of April this coming year. If you've been following the saga, you won't have been too surprised to discover it wasn't just the date that moved, it was also the course. In its latest iteration, the Isle of Wight road races will actually take place over the 12.4 mile course originally announced for the diamond races that were scheduled for October 2020 and, of course, cancelled due to COVID. By now, the Diamond Road Race organisation sunk without trace. Their website's no longer online. And whilst there's support for the races, I have to say there is also considerable opposition from local residents. Not surprisingly, since the event will run on public roads and slices through some villages. The following month, locals actually gave the event a thumbs down in a vote. If it does get off the ground, promoters are trying to persuade locals to think about how the Isle of Man benefits from their races. That's the carrot being dangled in front of the local councils. And also in August, the Science of Being Seen got a write-up on the Devitt Insurance website, which was jolly nice of them. Now, Science of Being Seen, as you probably know, I created that over the winter of 2011-2012 for Kent Fire and Rescue. It was used as part of the pilot Biker Down course, and we got a Prince Michael of Kent International Safety Award for our Biker Down courses at the end of 2012. And with that behind us, Biker Down went forward to be picked up pretty much nationally by other fire and rescue services. Most of the fire and rescue services by the end of 2020 were running Biker Down. Most of those were using a version of Science of Being Seen. Now, when COVID put everything on hold, of course, I had personally delivered the Biker Down in Kent for almost 10 years. Now, sadly, a new third module has been prepared for Biker Down if and when it resumes. It's been on and off this spring and summer. I'll continue working on Science Being Seen personally, and I will continue to update you on that. The next version of event to watch out for there will be February. Right, a couple of questions. John Sinclair, one question actually. John Sinclair said good morning, and he's also asked what happened to the building of the Welsh Racetrack. Well, that's a saga in itself, John. Lots of money from the Welsh National Assembly pumped into the organisation, absolutely no output from it. Basically, I don't think there was ever a hope in hell of building a top quality racetrack right on the very edge of the Brecon Beacon National Park. I think it was always pie in the sky, and there was no way that was going to happen. The other event you may be referring to was a time trial event that was suggested to be held on Ministry of Defence roads, which would have been opened up for the event. The problem there was that they wanted to run a time trial, and the circuit was so short that they've only managed to have got about half a dozen riders out on any particular race before the leaders caught up came back to the grid with the back markers still waiting to take off. So that was another non-starter. The interesting thing is some of the same team that proposed the original Isle of Wight road race were involved with that particular event. Yeah, I have covered that in the past on Facebook. September. Now, bike crashes always make for depressing post-bank holiday headlines, but this month, it seemed to me that after the August bank holiday, there were more crashes than usual. And 1 week later, another crash caused the air ambulance to be mobilised. It had to go to support a rider who had crashed on, guess what, the air ambulance charity ride. It's kind of beggars belief, really. And sadly, at the end of the month, a Harley rider died after a loss of control collision at the age of 93. I know I said it before, but it's really frustrating because what we see over and over again are the same accidents: smithies at junctions, crashes on corners, overtaking going wrong, riding too fast and too close when there are other vehicles around, and group riding is always overrepresented in bike crashes. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, but far too many riders blame bad luck when they should be pointing the finger at poor skills and rubbish decisions. In Tokyo, a Toyota-built self-driving bus hit and injured a visually impaired Paralympics athlete. days after an investigation into collisions of their self-driving cars with emergency vehicles. Another Tesla actually hit a stationary police vehicle and an SUV that was also stopped at the scene. That was in Florida. So that crash came amidst increased scrutiny of Tesla's driver assistance features and the way that Tesla markets them. For example, the so-called autopilot feature is standard in all new vehicles, but despite the name, autopilot does not make Tesla's vehicles autonomous, and it actually requires the driver to remain attentive behind the wheel. As usual, Tesla did not respond to new service requests for comment. Here at home, we were told GB plates were out. A new UK plate was now a legal requirement for travelling abroad, and that it would unite the whole of the four nations under the one banner. Emma Raducanu fever hit the biking world when it was revealed that the US Open winner had ridden MX bikes before turning to tennis full time, and a PC was caught selling police bike boots on eBay. Now, one thing I try to provide you all with here on Survival Skills is good, practical, and above all, factually correct information. Of course, I do sometimes say my advice is based on opinion, but I do try to explain why I say what I do. And it's one of the reasons that my posts tend to be a few minutes long, whether they're here as on my better biking tips or whether it's a written post. And it's why I rarely use Twitter for anything other than to point you in the direction of a longer article. Now, not everyone's so cautious, and one thing I have found is that ROSPA have been posting quick bite, sound bite safety advice, and it's not always very accurate. Now, this tip that they put out in September correctly said motorist fatigue contributes to thousands of collisions every year. Always make sure you get a good night's sleep before a long journey and never drive when tired. And that they also go on to say that if you become tired whilst driving or riding, stop in a safe place. Now, all that makes perfect sense. What doesn't is this: have 2 caffeinated drinks and a short nap. Think about it. Drink caffeine and then try to sleep. There's something seriously wrong with that advice. October. As we headed into autumn, the fuel crisis was now in full swing, and that was starting to impact my training. Now, right at the beginning of the month, I told you how I had toured 6 local petrol stations at 7 a.m. looking for fuel for the bike for a course in Oxford tomorrow, and not one had fuel. There were reports locally that one got fuel in the afternoon, but the queue was so long it was causing traffic chaos half a mile away. So in the event, I managed to scavenge out of my spare bike and my classic Honda enough fuel to top my tank up to the brim. And that would have been just about enough to get me there and back, although no margin for error. As it happened, when I did get to the meeting point with my trainee at the A34 services in Oxford, they did have fuel and they didn't even have a queue. So I was able to top up my tank, but also a 5-litre can, which was in the top box. Rather more importantly, though, the shortage was hitting blood bikers who are still involved, of course, in moving blood deliveries around, but also urgent COVID samples too. And another knock-on effect of this was several riders reported breaking down and finding water in the bottom of the petrol tank. And this was probably from cisterns being drained to the very bottom as the petrol ran out. By the following week, the army were driving emergency tankers to the areas with the worst shortages, and that was finally beginning to ease the dry pumps. I'm sure we still haven't got to the bottom of this story. It was blamed variously on the switch from E5 to E10, although why that would affect diesel supplies is not entirely obvious. It was blamed on driver shortages, which presumably pre-existed before the fuel crisis and still exist after the driver crisis, after the fuel crisis, because I don't think the recruitment campaign has actually managed to produce lots more HGV drivers on the roads. And it was also blamed, of course, on panic buying. Any shortage usually is. But if you think about it, the shortage wouldn't have lasted past the first fill up. As it was, it went on for about 3 weeks, and most of us was having to making several fill-ups in that time. So I honestly don't think it was panic buying was the problem either. So I don't know what the problem was. Maybe we'll find out at some point in the future. Another shortage was still being sorted out. The DVSA, remember, were recruiting new examiners, but existing examiners threatened to go on strike because the DVSA wanted to fit an extra test into the working day, and they would have done that by shortening the time between tests and slicing into the examiner's lunch break. The DVSA did actually drop the plan. Meanwhile, the DVLA announced that they were planning major changes to the digital license. There was a warning also of a backlog in license renewals as the COVID extension deadline approached. If you recall, licenses were about to expire were extended by the DVLA because of their inability to process things last year. And so what happened? Well, a friend of mine has she sent her license off to be renewed in late October, and she contacted them between Christmas and New Year to find out where it was, and she heard that they were just starting to get to grips with the application sent in early October. So hopefully she'll get a new license soon, but clearly there's a huge backlog in sorting that out. In other news, a Chesterfield teenager staged a fake crash in Mansfield, which resulted in police, fire, and ambulance all attending. Road was closed for an hour as the casualty pretended to slip in and out of consciousness. He told the medics he couldn't feel his legs or the right side of his body before being taken to hospital. But police subsequently discovered the whole incident had taken place right under a CCTV camera, and they showed the rider carefully laying the bike in the road before climbing partially underneath it, and he was prosecuted for wasting police time. I'm rather surprised he got a fixed penalty notice, as incidents like that can attract seriously heavy fines and even prison sentences. In other news, drivers and riders who pass the red X on a smart motorway will now face fines and penalty points. It's not just advisory anymore, it is now enforced. The government also announced they were planning legislation that would turn off EV chargers at peak hours, presumably because they were starting to realise that by switching to electric vehicles, everybody would come home and plug them in just about the time that the 6 o'clock news starts. Police watchdog found that what many had suspected for a long time, that some speed cameras are installed to make money, and Tesla pulled their latest beta software update from their cars. The question there being asked is, what was beta software doing in a car anyway? I delivered my first in-person Science of Being Seen presentation since February 2020 to a group in Gloucester, and a riding tips from survival skills appeared on the Devitt bike features page. I mentioned poor safety advice as well from that Twitter account, but in October, a Gwent road safety campaign appeared to suggest that being insufficiently visible was a factor in motorcycle crashes that didn't involve other vehicles. I'm not quite sure how they worked that one out. And there's no such thing as being insufficiently visible anyway. An object is either visible or it isn't. Visible means capable of being seen. So it's not really surprising that riders and drivers combined have such confused ideas about why these crashes happen. And in one sad piece of news, British racing legend Paul Smart died following a collision with a car. He was 78. Paul Smart actually sold me my first motorcycle. Moving on quickly to November, the big news was the crash of the MC Edwards insurance business. The Financial Services Compensation Scheme declared that MCE Insurance Company Limited had failed. It was a Gibraltar-based company, sold motorbike, private car, van and commercial vehicle insurance products in the UK through its broker MCE Insurance, which continues to operate. Those who have been affected by having insurance under MCE Edwards will receive payouts, but I believe there will be a reduced payout on a claim. So it's not all good news, and it certainly wasn't the you won't be affected issue that came out in some stories at the time. Also in November, the TfL reported they were set to earn rather less than they expected from the extended ultra low emissions zone charge. In October, you'll recall that ULEZ spread out to cover the entire area inside the north and south circular roads, which unfortunately also includes me. They predicted about 135,000 cars and vans would have to pay the £12.50 levy, and the move was expected to generate around 2 million a day in charges and also fines for non-compliance. But it seems that some drivers have switched to cleaner vehicles rather more quickly than expected, or have simply cut out journeys. And so the latest report suggested that they'll earn around 600 million less than anticipated over the next 3 years. In another story from the courts, a 60-year-old rider got a suspended sentence after a crash that left his pillion dead. But in a similar case in Scotland, the rider walked free after the court found his case unproven. The Met were also themselves under investigation after they sold a bike with a 250cc engine as a 125, and it was therefore bought by a learner rider, and unfortunately he was subsequently killed in a crash. And Tesla, yes, they're back in the news again. This time drivers were locked out of their cars by a server error. Something that Zero, I think, set an unhealthy precedent, and that was selling a bike which you could upgrade via store purchases. In other words, a bit like software that you buy with add-ons that you unlock by paying more money. The basic Zero costs you X amount, and then you can unlock things like extra battery capacity by paying more. So the battery capacity is actually already built into the bike. It's just the software stopping you using it. And I think that is a very, very worrying development indeed. And over in Mexico, the F1 organizers, the FIA, produced a $10 motorcycle helmet that meets all the necessary UN standards, which makes you rather wonder what Arai and Shoei are doing with the other $490 that they charge for their helmets. And so finally to December. The big news here was the shock slash of the electric vehicle grant without warning. Interestingly, several of the manufacturers instantly stepped in by applying their own grant to maintain prices, which rather suggests that they can probably afford to sell the bikes for rather less than they're charging at the moment already, and that the manufacturers and the distributors have been pocketing the grant themselves. It's not really been going to help drivers and riders move to electric vehicles. The most bizarre story of the year involved a dead man who was allegedly taken for a final bike ride in Ecuador. He was apparently exhumed from his coffin and taken for a spin with full permission of his parents. I watched the video and my first thought was stunt. I don't believe it was true. At the other end of the weird news spectrum, a Scottish man stole 2 Buells because he thought they were scrap. They'd simply been parked up during the pandemic. And a man in India, I think it was, it might have been Thailand, I can't remember now. He tried to scam bikers that he'd hitched a lift from by claiming that a crash on the ride where he sat on the back of the bike had caused him a broken finger, and it turned out that he'd broken it weeks earlier, and it was in fact a crash compensation scam. One motorcyclist in the UK, however, was jailed. 5 others appeared in court on various offences relating to an antisocial riding event in East Sussex that occurred early in the year, in March. A group of 80-odd riders triggered multiple calls from drivers and other members of the public as they travelled along the A22 between Mansfield and the Lower Dicker. And the report said that specialist officers from the Surrey and Sussex Roads Policing Unit, the Specialist Enforcement Unit, divisional officers, and the National Police Air Service helicopter were all deployed to tackle the group who were riding in an antisocial manner. 4 riders were arrested, 2 of whom had attempted to evade the police. 7 motorcycles were also seized. Out in New Zealand, there was a very worrying case when a motorcycle instructor was found to have issued hundreds of false riding certificates, which allowed gang members to apply for motorcycle licenses without ever having taken any test. Tesla, well, it had to be, didn't it? They were under investigation again. This time it was for turning on a game playing feature, which was supposed to be used by the passenger, but could be accessed by the driver whilst on the move. Italian authorities, in a shock move, made off-road riding illegal. That story will develop, I'm sure. And London is now the most congested city in the world, according to one measure, thanks to the greening by putting in no vehicle zones and restricted widths for widened cycle lanes. In BP petrol stations, it's now mandatory to wear a mask again, and the RAC was demanding a cut in petrol prices from the sky-high point reached after the shortage, as fuel prices have come down again, or oil prices have come down, fuel hasn't come down to match. I also featured the probably two weirdest bikes of the year, a Poimo inflatable e-scooter and a 1960s Bat bike from the TV series, which went under the hammer. And more seriously, in bike shows around the world, the BSA came back with a Gold Star 650 single. Triumph rolled out their 1 millionth bike of the modern era, and Norton showed off a naked version of the sports bike, the V4SS, as a cafe racer. Right, okay, that is pretty much it for the year. I hope you've enjoyed the rundown of what went on last year. We'll be back on what's today? It's Monday, isn't it? I'll be back on Wednesday, so just a couple of days' time, and we'll be back with the regular news and views and riding tips style of show. So that's the end of the retrospective today. Enjoy the last day of the Christmas and New Year break. If you're riding out there, be safe. It's looking like a reasonably nice day here in the south of England. Oddly enough, the places I managed to visit over the last couple of days have just been miserable and wet and horrible. Lots of other people have been reporting lovely warm sunshine. I didn't see any of that, so I haven't been out on the bike. But if you do go out on the bike, stay safe. That's it from me, Kevin Williams and ELEVENSES, and hopefully see you on Wednesday.